Welcome back to the Sacred Acts podcast from the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Reverend Randy Partain.
And I am Dr. Alan Georgia. I am thrilled to be here in person. Last recording we had to do via Zoom, but now we are face-to-face with a shared microphone, which I hope means everything sounds crystal clear.
It's all an experiment with how we do this. We've done this individually, and now we're figuring out what this joint venture looks like.
Absolutely. Good to be here to talk about our spiritual lives and the practices that inform them. I know we have some new questions today that evolve on some of the topics we've already been talking about in new directions. So,
yes, we're hoping that this eventually becomes an opportunity for you to share your spiritual practices, maybe even some things that other people would not consider spiritual practices. But we're starting off with an Ask Us Anything series of episodes, just to pique your interest, maybe, or maybe to just give you the impression that you could listen to something else and be a lot more entertained.
And the you in this case not being me, but rather you, the listener.
You, the listener.
Yeah, you, the listener.
Yes. So we have a question, a big storytelling question from Donna Hertzberg, who says, I'm curious about Reverend Randy's path to Unitarian Universalist ministry. What steps in your life revealed the path that brought you here? Was it a surprise to you at any point, to your friends and family? And so I'm happy to dive into that, but I know you also have a path that has not been a straight line path and may have had some surprises along the way to ministry. So maybe we can both just take turns with bits of narrative here.
I will look forward to talking about the many very not straight paths that are represented in our various lives. So that sounds. But this is also, I appreciate your note about these being this is a big question. There's lots to unpack. So if you were going to start that story, where would you start, Randy?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. I was raised in a Christian household, raised in a Christian context. My grandfather was a Baptist minister, but not a hellfire and brimstone, pulpit-pounding Baptist minister. His story is kind of unique as well, but he was primarily ministering to migrant populations of Spanish-speaking agricultural workers in Florida. And so his primary ministry was to people that needed a different kind of message than what you might think of as a traditional Southern Baptist preacher. But I did not go to a Baptist church because when my mother visited the Baptist church in the town where I grew up, she thought that the people there were rude. And so we went to a Methodist church instead, because to her, it was all the same Jesus. So I got a Methodist background with some Baptist sprinkled in. And that made less and less sense to me, but I spent a long time trying to make it still make sense, because it seemed to make sense to other people in my life, and I thought I must be missing something, so I just needed to try to faith better, or believe better, or more deeply, or something. I was going to get it if I just kept going. And there were moments when it was meaningful for me to have that Christian context. But in my teens, I started working as a music minister, just starting off playing piano at a local Methodist church, doing their music on Sunday mornings and accompanying the choir. And I worked in a variety of churches over the years, but ultimately was the minister of worship and the arts for a mid-sized Lutheran church in Texas. And we had a variety of services on Sunday morning. There were different kinds of music. There were handbell choirs. There was a drama ministry that I was in charge of. And it was a lot of satisfying stuff, except for the part about the beliefs that had started to make less and less sense to me. And so what was being taught in that place was not that different than what was taught in a lot of other Christian spaces, but it began to make so little sense to me to show up there and live as an imposter is what it felt like. I was showing up as an imposter every day. And so I quit. I left that position, and I did not go back to a Christian setting. And I had my wilderness journey. I wouldn't call it a dark night of the soul, because it was really just like a long journey into greater and greater questions. And so I explored, and I had an opportunity not being attached to a church. I explored other religious contexts. Theism did not make a lot of sense to me, and so there were a lot of pagan practices that did make sense to me, more nature-based religion. I explored atheist groups. There were some atheist groups that were just very interested in being angry at the church, and I was done being angry at the church after a little while, and I wanted to know what was next. And they said, we get angry at the church for different things. Essentially, they didn't say that, but that is the impression that I got. And so the American Humanist Association was a place where I found some people who had similar beliefs, but their way of building community was not particularly satisfying. And so I was missing that piece of community. The community part was the part that was the most challenging. And not that the personal work was easy, because that was very challenging, but doing it alone was especially challenging. So that eventually got me to a Unitarian Universalist church, because I was complaining or lamenting the lack of community in enough spaces that a friend said, have you ever been to a Unitarian Universalist church? And the only thing I knew about Unitarians and Universalists was they appeared in a book called Kingdom of the Cults, which was big in Christian circles when I was probably in middle school, maybe early high school. And it was about all of the different groups of people who believe the wrong things, and you should watch out for them. And it was all about different cults that are dangerous.
I feel like I can just imagine the yellow-paged paperback that Kingdom of the Cults was on a shelf, like just a kind of a flimsy...
Man, you are so wrong.
Oh, am I?
It was such a thick hardback tome.
Okay. On the other end of the spectrum.
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, apparently there are lots of groups that believe just the wrong things and dangerous things. And so I remember that. Unitarian Universalists were among the groups who just believed the absolute wrong things based on the very, very Christian fundamentalist version of what the right things are. And so that got me to the steps of a Unitarian Universalist church. And I'm going to pause there and just ask Alan about your journey, and then I'll come back to the part where I get to ministry after I give you a
Understood.
moment.
We'll do two parts, and that'll be really helpful. So, and it's I feel like I have known elements of this part of your path, but I don't know that I've heard you lay them out this way. So it's interesting to track with them, both in similar ways and in different ways, because I also have a grandfather minister that was formative for my experience. In fact, my namesake, my grandfather, was Alan, so that was always very meaningful to me. But his unusual background was that he was Jewish, a Jewish agnostic, a cynical Jewish agnostic from Chicago, the son of the black sheep of his accomplished Jewish family, who instead of going to law school or medical school at Brown University like their family had done, he became a lifeguard at the Black Hotel in Chicago in like the 20s and 30s. So all that is to say, what he did that shaped his life is that he married a British Methodist who was all from sort of Philadelphia, and like my great-grandmother was like a suffragette and was coming from that context. And over some years, there was a conversion process where he started, sort of attending, I think, their church, and then he, sort of had a real middle of the evening conversion moment, and he, sort of was immediately sort of brought forward, and then some years later, he became a minister, a Methodist minister. So that was sort of the background of my own sort of ecclesial life, was this heritage of Methodists in the backstory. But the real formative thing is something I shared in one of our last episodes, which was I stumbled into this English-style boys' choir, which I realize now, and Randy, your story is very much patterns some of the experiences I've learned a lot of people in Christian contexts have, where things don't sort of work for them after time sort of evolving in those contexts. And I didn't realize at the time how liberating it was that my experience of God was sort of severed from the institutional realities of things, because my boy choir was totally secular, but we were singing all this sacred music. So it was just enough there that I could trace that out because it became meaningful to me, but I didn't have anyone mediating my experience of God. It's like those were not connected in a way I had to worry about. And weirdly, as a result, what it meant is that it never occurred to me that some man in a flowy robe could tell me anything about God that was uniquely true, or sort of, whatever it was. So while I did, similar to some of the story you've described, Randy, of being involved in churches, my own experience was never that was never where the meaning part lay. That was just that was the expression, or like the venue of some of these other sorts of things, but the God was always sort of bigger. But what I will note is that my pathway was really affected by the people who I think very much factor in a story like the one you described, of the individuals at the actual places and some of those things, that community that you're describing. Because I think I often met some communities that were not as affirming, and part of that was very formative for me was because I went to an evangelical undergraduate college, because I thought that Jesus would just be enough, and that even though I knew that I didn't agree with all these people and all that kind of stuff, that these were people I wanted to learn to care about. And instead they told me my baptism didn't count, and that I wasn't. So I ended up having a very adversarial sort of situation in my undergrad, and I did a lot of but it also made me very independent as a thinker in a way that has made me fit into a UU context in a very particular way. Because one of my Bible professors at the time was notable because he was invited to translate for the NIV Bible, which is like a Bible, one of the famous sort of translations that's often used. And his translation was rejected for being overly literal.
Oh.
So he was that was the energy. Those are the vibes he brought to our education situation. And so he and I sort of butted heads, and it just sort of made me lean into these things in sort of unusual ways. But it felt a little pinballish, where you're just kind of hitting a stopper and you get thrown in this other sort of direction. And so what I will say is that one of the reasons why I am not a minister at this point in my life is because I took a left turn, what I thought was still very much in this space of calling, toward academic work, which I did, and that was still meaningful. It was still part of that pathway. It still felt very much like a sense of calling or a sense of purpose. But we don't get to say what the world is, and in a previous age, or if things had been a little bit different or easier, I'm sure I could have easily settled into a world where I was teaching students. But it turns out that was not the path that was in front of me necessarily. So while I did plenty of teaching, and have even done teaching quite recently, there has never really been a meaningful way forward there. So I have struggled to sort of land in those places and sort of find my own time. But and I'm going to lean on this because this is a really paradoxical and kind of ironic moment, is that the way that I found myself being called back into work among people in congregations was Indeed.com told me that a UU congregation in Cleveland was looking for a religious educator.
Wow.
And since the last job I had that wasn't in academia was at Starbucks, and I didn't want to work a job like that again, I was like, well, I'll give this a try. And having brought up the Kingdom of the Cults, I actually had, ironically, a very parallel thing, which is I had a copy from my grandfather's library, a copy of Leo Rosen's Religions of America, which is almost the exact opposite of what you're describing.
Nice.
You could probably still find, we might even have a copy in like the library or something. This was like a thick volume that was like 10 pages on every denomination in the country. And it was written by, I want to say the UU section was probably written by like Robert Fulghum or some UU person from like, I don't know, 1972 or something. Mm-hmm. but that just sort of laid it all out. And what's interesting is that when you have a book like that, very much the opposite of Kingdom of the Cults, is that they all kind of seem broadly equivalent. So my awareness of Unitarian Universalism when I was younger was informed by this one book that had just sort of laid out, like, oh, this is sort of what the polity is like, and this is sort of what the beliefs are. So I always had that in mind of sort of Unitarian Universalists being this. And I actually knew some UU seminary students when I was at Methodist Seminary I attended. But all that is to say, my own process involved this accidental moment of coming into things. But that's the second part of the story I will tell. But let's return to your situation before we get to the end of your story, turning into the beginning of the pathway into ministry. So
Sure. Yeah.
Where do we pick up that thread?
So I guess a piece of it, going back to college days, I was almost in the Methodist ordained ministry. I was a candidate for ministry in the Methodist Church at one point in time.
Full candidate, okay.
And I there were some little hitches and bumps in the road, but the real thing that gave me pause, I can't even remember what the question was. There was some kind of a question on the application for seminary that was asking me essentially to forecast something about what my ministry was going to be in a meaningful way, like what was I hoping to accomplish through being a minister, and it was so specific, or it seemed that at the time, and I thought, I have no idea. I was just out of college, and it was like this paralyzing question because I literally sat staring at the sheet of paper for a long time, not moving, not really able to start answering it. And I eventually said, I'm not ready to do this. Apparently, this is not the time. And so I continued in music ministry. I also taught college courses for a while. At a certain point, I made a decision to do music ministry full time at that Lutheran church I talked about, rather than being all in an academic career. I think, you were mentioning that it was a different path, and it wasn't ministry, it was this academic path. And I think, to me, as I look back and as I hear other people's stories, I think how much everything is ministry. And that really there are opportunities that we have. I want to say even working at Starbucks, even though I'm not sure everybody makes it that or gives people working at Starbucks the opportunity for it to be that. But I think there is so much ministry that happens outside of a church setting.
That'll be a good question to come back to as we get to the end of our path stories, because that's a really rich question that invites all of us who are listening to think about our own ministries that we're up to. Yeah. So yeah, you didn't end up doing the ministry of academic teaching.
I didn't.
In the full way that you might have, but
it was something that wound up being a piece of my life while I was in that searching period. Yeah. And I'll tell you, my first actual experience of a Unitarian Universalist church, where it wasn't just reading about it or hearing about it from somebody else, but my visceral experience of it was a bit off-putting, because my concept of God at the time was the God that had been defined for me in all of these other settings. It wasn't a God that I had really defined for myself. It was a bunch of other people had told me what that word meant. Yeah. And I didn't agree with the definitions did not all match, but I didn't agree with any of them.
Understood.
So I listened to some of the words and I saw some of the hymns. I did the famous thing. I did the joke. I was the joke that looked ahead in the hymnal to see what the words were, to decide whether I wanted to sing them or not. And to come up with different words. Can I put love in place of God in this hymn and it still makes sense? Can I agree with it in that way? So even though we don't have creeds that we recite out loud, there are some times in Unitarian Universalist spaces where a point where a person is in their theological journey conflicts with whatever we're saying or exploring or singing in that moment. And what I have learned now is that that's okay and appropriate and perfectly fine. But my experience the first time in a Unitarian Universalist church was, well, this place isn't for me either.
Oh, interesting.
And the phrase that I heard, I'm sure other people have heard, but people asked me, and I said, well, I don't know that I believe in God, and so I have a problem with the words that you're using and with some of the things that are said. And they said, oh, just make that word mean whatever you want it to mean. And I thought, that's really fine for you to say. How do I do that? And there wasn't really a context where this community of people would walk alongside me while I figured out what I needed that word to mean. But there was enough that kept me coming back to a Unitarian Universalist church, and I kept doing my own spiritual exploration, and it was not long before I recognized that I had done something that a lot of people were not doing. This personal journey of defining a spirituality for myself was not something that a lot of people had done in their lives, even in Unitarian Universalist spaces. They had explored lots and lots of other religious traditions, and they had been to the mosques and the synagogues and the Buddhist temples and all of those things, and they knew what was practiced in other spaces, but not in a way that said, this is my personal spirituality. It was like a knowledge that didn't have a personal value in their lives. Not everybody. There's lots of UUs that have done that kind of work. But I thought, if I had had somebody, a community of people even, walking alongside me while I did that work, it would have been so much different. It would have been better, richer somehow. And so I saw that the way to help that happen was to be in ministry in a Unitarian Universalist setting where I could help people figure out that work and walk alongside one another. And it's tough because the Unitarian Universalist Church has a very rigorous process for ordination and fellowship.
Known for being among the most demanding among mainline or sort of old, well-established traditions.
Yeah. And it's not fixed. It's still evolving and developing. And so the process that I started with is not the process that I continued with because it changed midstream.
Yeah.
So part of that process involves an internship at a Unitarian Universalist church. I was in seminary at an evangelical Christian seminary as an openly atheist, humanist, Unitarian Universalist because I wanted to be in person with people. I did not want to do remote learning. And my wife, Joy, had a position in Houston. That was where her work was, and it didn't make sense to move halfway across the country for a couple of years of seminary and not have the financial undergirding of her career. So I remained in Houston and did work at a Christian seminary.
Wow.
With a largely African-American student population, a lot of women, a lot of black students. And some of the people in the black church tradition were ministers already. Their congregation had recognized their ministerial capacity, had ordained them, and then said, you might want to go get some education. And so they went to get a Master of Divinity degree after they were already serving in a ministerial role. And that's like the opposite of what Unitarian Universalists do.
Like exactly the opposite, right? Yeah.
So I went and got my Master of Divinity degree, a portion of which was doing chaplaincy work at a hospital and doing an internship at a Unitarian Universalist church. And I was with other Unitarian Universalist ministers in that cluster. And it came time for me to go to what is called the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee. That is where a group of wise individuals who are still no more holy than anybody else, but are at least wise enough to be able to ask good questions of people who want to be ministers. I was supposed to go before them to be fellowshipped after my internship. And there were enough voices, I could count them on one hand. There were 5 or less voices, but there were enough voices that essentially told me that I needed to be somebody other than my authentic self in order to be an effective minister, that I canceled that appointment with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee.
Wow.
And I said, okay, well, this is not for me either. There is not a community where I can do what I would like to do in a way that is meaningful for other people. I will just go do my thing, and I will be an isolated person who has done a ton of spiritual work, and I will just be happy with that. And there are enough Unitarian Universalist churches in the Houston area, and throughout my time in seminary, I had spoken at all of them at one point or another, and they kept inviting me back. And so after I had decided that I was not going to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, I kept getting invited to speak in Unitarian Universalist spaces. Every other week I was at a Unitarian Universalist church on Sunday. Not because it was my job, but just because they were paying me as a guest minister to come in and speak. And one of those congregations asked me to do their summer programming. Typically, they would have a different guest minister come in each week of the summer while their minister was on vacation over the summer. And this year they asked if I would just do their whole summer program. And I said, yes, I will do that. And I kept hearing enough people affirming my presence in that ministerial role that I decided that that handful of voices who had told me otherwise didn't know what they were talking about, and I had given them way too much power over the course of my life. So I rescheduled my appointment with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee. I'm skipping a little piece of the story, but it's not a significant one. So I rescheduled with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, went back before them, and they said, we don't know. We're not sure, because it turns out that one of the people that I had worked with during my internship had fallen from grace.
Oh.
And so it was assumed that I was going to be like this person who had fallen from grace, because that was my mentor.
Wow.
And so I was guilty by association. And I said, would you allow me to go do ministry while I am working on the things that you say I need to work on? Because there was a small congregation in Houston that wanted me to be their minister. And the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee said, yeah, you can do that. It was a small enough group of people. They didn't think I would break anything.
It was too small to be dangerous.
Too small to be dangerous.
Understood.
And so I went back and I did that. And it was great, because it gave me an opportunity to be doing meaningful ministry in a way that that had its challenges, but also, I got to hone my skill and be aware of all of the things that go along with being a minister that they don't teach you in seminary. And then I went back to the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, and they said, oh, well, we approve you without reservation. And I thought, okay, I am the same person that I was the last time. But I was standing on my own merit at that point. Not my own merit. Because I hate that the whole idea of a meritocracy is so dangerous in this society, and I don't want to act like I was really just there without the support of a community. I was not standing on my own merit. I was standing with the undergirding of a congregation that had experienced my ministry for a year and been able to say, this is working, this is worthwhile, this person is fit.
So standing more on your own track record in a context with people. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I had a valuable testimony of others that could back me up. There was also some feedback that I gave to the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee after the first time. And I won't go into all of that now, but what I noticed is I showed up differently the second time, and they showed up differently the second time.
Wow.
And it's largely the same group of people. They try to have an individual minister experience the same committee throughout their process. And it isn't always possible, because those people are volunteers.
Sure.
But and it's a lot of work. But they showed up differently too. And so they were looking at me, and I was showing up more clearly, and it was a much better experience.
Wow.
And then after you get fellowshipped, then you get ordained, and so the congregation had an ordination for me, and
This was the congregation you were at for just the year?
this was yes,
Okay.
yes,
Understood.
and the rest, as they say, is history, but it's still being made. But the process was not a straight line, and it was not always a certainty. There have been times all along the way where I have thought, I do not need to do this.
Mm.
There are other things that I can do with my life. And there are, honestly, like any other human being, there are days when I wish I had done something else. But there are so many more days where I am grateful for this, and there are so many other days where it is absolutely fulfilling to be where I am, doing what I am with a community of human beings that I would really not want to be doing anything else. And it becomes a choice rather than something that I was locked into that I really didn't have any escape route out of. I have had plenty of escape routes. And yet, this is a choice I'm really, really satisfied with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, having heard that sort of that transition piece, I think the vocation ministry purpose question is a really interesting one, because that does also intersect with my experience in this congregation, which is, I mean, this is the irony from my own personal spiritual life, is that, when I was younger, I had hoped to do the academic work I ended up doing. I always wanted to be in conversation with people. That was just a given for me, and I did not see that as sort of a problem, but I never quite found the venue for those two things to sort of work. So when I started doing work in an academic setting and a congregation at the same time, it was this congregation, and it has allowed me to explore this question of what our callings are and what our spiritual motivations are in our own lives, because it wasn't something I had planned. Like, I didn't have a future orientation where I said, you know what, I'm going to teach in universities and then also orient myself around a UU congregation at some point of, sort of later on. But that is actually sort of how things have sort of emerged for me. So it makes me wonder this question for our conversational purposes is how might we invite this idea of ministry into broader conversation and broader ways of doing it. And I will be curious to ask you that question, but I can start with the frame of my own, because I was just chatting with one of our very own congregants, who I won't name here because this is,
Sure.
But they were describing a conversation they were having on purpose with a person who they felt needed to have a chat, and that they had sort of caught them, and that they knew that it would be good if that person asked them some questions. Basically sort of invited them into sharing some things. And I said, oh, so you're the one doing ministry today. And of course they sort of guffawed and said, oh no, don't put that on me. Like, that's not the sort of the work that I'm doing. But it really invited this question about what it is that we are doing when we say we are doing ministry. Because also, an important, a distinction here. You've described the UU process is very involved, and there's a fellowshipping, council. There's all these other things. By contrast, a black church that had students at your seminary, opposite dynamic. The ordination, the ministry part precedes the education part and those sort of official things. And so it'd be interesting to think about ways that we might have seen or invited other people into that way of seeing their own lives as ministry. I'm curious if you have any examples or sort of things to bring your own story into conversation with other people's experiences, other venues where ministry happens.
Well, so I guess the distinction that I would make is that there is such a thing as professional ministry. There is a role of professional minister that involves training and continuing education and a level of knowledge and practice of things that other people do not take the time to study and hone the skills of. So there are things that are involved with professional ministry that are I guess, a bit rarefied. But ministry, to me, is a much broader umbrella than just that professional sense. It's the things that people do when they extend care to one another, and it's the ways that we are present with people. I would say the ways that we hold space for others without imposing our own will on them. And so there are different paths even to professional ministry, but there are even more paths for people to minister to and alongside one another. So
maybe almost like being a minister versus doing ministry.
Yeah.
As almost two different kind of expressions.
Yeah.
Of a similar thing, but in different contexts.
I would say so.
Yeah.
And I think the word calling came up a little while ago, and so I have already said that I feel like I have been making choices and I've been making decisions and all of that, but those decisions and those choices, when they've felt right and when they, to me, are wise and appropriate decisions and choices, are the things that make my heart sing. And the things that allow me to show up as my authentic self in a way that is in meaningful service to other people. And it's not a way that is abusive of others or of myself. And so that line of doing what is truly fulfilling for me and also intersects in a meaningful way with the needs of other human beings.
Other human beings, yeah.
If there's another way of defining a calling, I don't know what that would be.
Well, I think that intersection point is also really important, and also maybe a reason as we're sort of wrapping up this conversation about your particular path, but also looking forward to inviting our congregation of wonderful people to talk about their spiritual practices, is vocation is alive for all of us, and that intersection, as you're describing, is so important because you are an important, crucial part of that, but so is the world.
Right.
So where you're meeting is this thing, this calling, this sense of purpose that meets a sense of receiving.
Yeah. So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate, Alan, you talking about your particular journey as well. And maybe there will be other people, maybe as we start thinking about sacred acts, it won't just be about spiritual practices, but maybe it will be about the ministry that people do. And we can think about it in that context, maybe in a way that breaks some ideas open.
So, and especially, I very much hope that we can see that, especially if it also invites us to see maybe there are things that we've been doing that have been ministry the whole time, even if it didn't frame itself that way. The spiritual acts, the practices, the things that are happening in our own lives suddenly reframe something that used to be, I don't know, childcare turns into a certain kind of caring. Working at Starbucks turns into a certain kind of acts of service. There's all these different venues where maybe our own spiritual lives blossoms forth in a different way. So I'm excited to hear everyone else's path story as we have been able to talk about some of our paths today.
Yeah, and when you put it like that, the thought that occurs to me is, I don't have to have a better definition of God than what you just said. But that may be a whole can of worms that we don't want to open today. So for now, I will just say thank you for listening, and I hope you create something beautiful today.
I look forward to next time.